When I said to people at home that it was the first time I'd ever spoken after dinner, so it's the first after-dinner speech I've ever given. And everyone said, but you have to tell jokes. And I said, but I don't do jokes. They said, you'll have to tell one. So my only joke is Theresa May. And I would like to extend a thank you from those of us in the UK who are extraordinarily grateful for the tolerance and courteousness with which you've treated the British as we've tormented ourselves trying to extrapolate ourselves from one of the best global international institutions that's ever been created. But the story is still unresolved, as we know. I also like to start with two quick apologies. One is that I'm sorry I have to speak in English. I can't speak in German, and at the end of a long day you've already had, so I apologize for that. And also that because I'm an outsider, I didn't know what your level of knowledge or understanding of children's rights was. So I have started with a sort of introduction, so please forgive me if it's all terribly, terribly familiar and boring, and I'll try and go through it fairly quickly so that I'm not covering too much already familiar ground. Okay, so I was interested that the word, when I discovered that the word health actually comes from a German term, meaning restoring a person to wholeness, which is a really nice concept, I thought. But it's also important to be clear that the right to health obviously doesn't mean the right to be healthy. The World Health Organization defines it as a complete state of mental well-being, and the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is the body responsible for that treaty, has defined it very broadly, the right to health, as an inclusive right extending to all appropriate healthcare, but also looking at the broader social and economic determinants of health. And importantly, looking at the right to health, intrinsic to a right to health, being the right to participate in the decision-making, both at the individual and community and the broader level. So it's a very comprehensive definition of the right to health. So the elements necessary for health and well-being, I mean, these are pretty well documented and accepted. There are features related to social well-being, physical well-being, emotional well-being, mental well-being. And rights relate closely to those needs that we saw really during the 1970s, coming up to 1979, which was the International Year of the Child, an emerging consensus around those needs that children have if they're going to develop and achieve their optimum potential. And alongside that recognition and that consensus, there was a growing recognition of the importance of some level of accountability on the part of states to create environments in which those needs are fulfilled. And that means that they were translated, if you like, from being needs into establishing obligations on the part of states to ensure that those needs were met, and they established them as rights. And that led to the development of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, establishing those needs as the right of every child, and also imposing obligations on states accordingly. So we have a trajectory of human rights throughout the 20th century and beyond, focusing on children. So in the First World War era, with the setting up of the League of Nations, there was the Declaration on the Rights of the Child, which was very focused on protection, the protection of children. After the Second World War, we had the Universal Declaration of Rights and the 1959 UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child. Again, not a binding treaty, not the establishment of rights and accountability, but a recognition that children do have rights. And again, very focused on protection. And then after 1966 and onwards, we had the much broader development of human rights treaties, the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights, and on economic, social and cultural rights, non-discrimination treaties, and so on, and leading then up to 1989. with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was drafted over 10 years. I mean, it was put forward, as you're probably very aware, by the Polish government in a sort of honour to Korczak, who was one of the early child rights advocates and educationalists and a paediatrician. And it took 10 years to draft, largely because there was a kind of complete impasse linked with the Cold War. So you had the US on the one hand arguing that this treaty should be about civil and political rights, and you had the Soviet bloc on the other hand saying this should be about social and economic and cultural rights, and there the twain were able to meet. And it was only really with the coming down of the barriers associated with the Cold War and there was a rapprochement that it became possible to begin to negotiate. And it did therefore result in a comprehensive treaty in which all of those rights were embedded. And it has now been universally ratified, except, of course, for the USA, who, despite having taken a very, very, very active role in the drafting process, are not prepared to sign up to it. But then they're not prepared to sign up to other human rights treaties either. You ratified in 1992. One of the important things, particularly in relation to health, is that the social and economic rights are subject to what's known as progressive realisation. In other words, it's recognised that for many, many states it's not possible to implement fully at the point of ratification. It's going to take time because it costs. There are big, significant resources attached to it. But it's not a cop-out. It doesn't mean that the German government or the British government or the Burundi government can say, well, we can't afford it, therefore we are subject to progressive realisation. This is as much as we can do. What states are required to do is put the maximum possible resources towards the fulfilment of those rights and not simply use it as an excuse. And they should be held to account on that very explicit obligation. And they are held to account partly by monitoring of professional bodies and NGOs and so on within countries and human rights commissions in countries, but also by the international treaty body, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which was set up to review states' reports every 5 years. So your government is expected to submit a report every 5 years to this international body, which meets 3 times a year in Geneva, and they will produce concluding observations which make comment on your progress. And states that have ratified elect the membership of that body. So the implications then of the treaty. It is now recognised as a framework of universal norms governing childhood, even though the states hasn't ratified. And interestingly, a few years ago, the US Supreme Court was ruling on whether or not the death penalty should apply to juveniles, which it did at that point in the United States. And when they came to consider this, they looked at the fact that the Convention on the Rights of the Child prohibits the death penalty for children, and that this did constitute a global standard, a globally accepted norm in the treatment of children, and therefore they ruled that that they should bring to an end the death penalty for children. So even though they haven't ratified, they cited it as a universal standard. And interestingly, I was in a car once going to a meeting in Italy with somebody who used to be the director of USAID, who was citing this case to me as an example of how profoundly undemocratic international law is and how appalling it was that the Supreme Court had ruled in this way when the Americans had never voted to sign up to the treaty. So there are very different ways of approaching it. Anyway, it's there. It also transforms, if you like, the way that we in most societies treat children, in the sense that typically in most countries around the world, children are viewed as rather passive recipients of adult care and protection. They're not seen as active agents in the realisation of their own rights. And the CRC demands that is recognised, that children are seen as subjects, as agents in their own lives and active participants growing in accordance with age and maturity in the exercise of their own rights. And that's a very different way of looking at childhood and conceptualising what we think of as childhood. The Convention introduces these three obligations: to fulfil, protect and respect all the rights, to extend those rights to every child, and interestingly it's every child within the jurisdiction. So citizenship is irrelevant. So for example, the children who have come through from, for example, from Syria or from Libya or from other parts of Africa coming through into Europe, they are entitled to exactly the same rights in the country in Europe in which they end up as every other child in relation to the Convention. That these are not linked to citizenship or status or legality even of entry. So undocumented children have the same rights as documented children, and the responsibility to report to an international committee. So the goal is recognition of the human dignity of every child, the realisation of the fundamental rights of those children, which is how you respect and recognise their fundamental dignity. So governments have to fulfil rights, they have to protect rights, and they have to respect rights, and they interlink these categories. So if you have sort of health and optimum development is an obligation. Governments have to put in money, they have to put in resources, they have to put in systems in order to make that possible. But that links with other rights. So it relates to, for example, respecting rights, access to information. Children can't make decisions about health if they don't have access to information, and so on and so forth. So they're all interlinked. Now, one of the important things about a child rights-based approach is that it is founded on a set of core principles which are intended to guide the way in which those rights are realised. So all human rights treaties are underpinned by this group of rights up at the top, that they are inalienable. In other words, they're portable. They exist wherever the child is. So, for example, this has been hugely challenging in the issue of corporal punishment. So the Committee on the Rights of the Child, I'm sure you know, has interpreted Article 19, the right to protection from all forms of violence, as including all forms of corporal punishment. And that applies whether the child is in a school, in an institution, in the penal institutions, or in the home. So those rights are portable. They apply wherever the child, you can't take them away from the child depending on where the child is. They're also universal, that they apply to all human beings by virtue of their humanity. They're indivisible. In other words, they are, you can't look at one right without looking at other rights. They come as a package, so you can't say, well, I'll focus on the right to health, but I'm not going to bother about the right to protection or the right to education, or that they are integrally linked and need to be seen as independent, interdependent and indivisible. And there also needs to be transparency and accountability. You cannot exercise a right if you don't know you have it, and there needs to be some mechanism of accountability. Now, depressingly, as we come up to 30 years anniversary of the Convention, the evidence seems to be that children in an extraordinarily large number of countries still don't know about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Huge numbers of children in countries across Europe don't know. Certainly in Africa, in Latin America, you see the same pattern, that children are still not fully aware that they have these rights. And similarly, most professionals are not adequately informed about the rights and what they mean for their practice. If you look at the concluding observations, these recommendations that the Committee on the Rights of the Child make, every single one, without exception, the committee say you need to be doing more to raise awareness amongst children that these rights exist, and raise awareness amongst the professionals who are working with them that they exist. Otherwise, you'll never change the culture. So there are a whole set of those sort of broad-based rights that apply to all human rights. And then the Committee on the Rights of the Child has identified these four as being central to children's to the realisation of rights. And these four, along with the others, need to be considered in the realisation of all other rights. So, for example, non-discrimination. There should be no discrimination on any grounds in relation to the realisation of rights. So the Convention was the first treaty ever to, it has a list of grounds, protected grounds from discrimination, and it spells out disability. It was the first treaty ever to mention explicitly that disability is a grounds for protection from discrimination. So, for example, in many countries, I don't know here, that in many countries there would be a policy that a child, for example, with Down syndrome would not be eligible for heart surgery in the same way as another child would be, on the basis that that child's quality of life didn't justify the intervention. So compliance with Article 2 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child would prohibit that kind of policy exclusion for a particular child. And it doesn't prohibit positive discrimination, so you can put into place a policy which gives which favours some children in order to level up the playing field. So, for example, in Nepal, after they ratified, a disability NGO decided to take the government to the Supreme Court because they argued that blind children were disadvantaged in public exams because you can't read Braille at the same speed that you can read script, and so they were disadvantaged. So they argued that they should be given longer in public examinations, and they won the case, and that was embedded in law. So using the Article 2 provision as a way of protecting those children's rights. In relation to best interests, I think probably most European countries prior to the Convention had some concept of best interests embedded in their children's legislation or their family legislation. But the CRC is much broader than most governments have traditionally provided, because it applies to children as individuals, but also children as a constituency. So that means that at a municipal level, a municipality needs to be thinking about policies and whether they are in the best interests of children. So, for example, a planning decision, a transport decision, a decision about whether to build, give permission to a factory to be built, needs to take into account children's health, pollution in the environment, accident potential, play facilities for children, and so on and so forth. So looking at holistically what would be the interest, how would the best interests of children be influenced by this particular policy. So it's much broader than traditionally understood. Article 6 talks about the right to life and optimum survival and development. Which seems kind of self-evident. One of the only countries I know where they have actually legislated for this is Chile, where they have introduced a law giving a right to development in law. And it's backed up by an absolute commitment to the provision of early intervention and assessment for children, to pick up delays in development and so on and so forth, access to early years, education and care, support for it's mainly, in reality, support for mothers as opposed to families, it's mainly mothers. So a whole set of provisions in statute directly in response to the CRC to ensure that the right to optimum development is embedded as a statutory right. And then finally, Article 12. Article 12 is probably the most radical and the most challenging article in the whole of the Convention. And I think that the drafters, when they were pushing for this, the United States were one of the strongest proponents of Article 12. It basically acknowledges that children have a right to be listened to, have their views taken into account, and to be taken seriously in accordance with age and maturity. And that's been interpreted by the Committee on the Rights of the Child very broadly. So they say basically that the onus is on us as adults to find ways of hearing and listening to what children are saying, not on children to find a way of communicating effectively with us. So, for example, they would say that babies, the small babies are entitled to be heard and can express views through body language, through expression, through facial expressions, and so on and so forth. There's a wonderful little Turkish video of a mother who is with a tiny baby who is failing to bond with the baby and really has been struggling. So she's been, they've provided her with a parent educator, and this little video, it's only sort of a minute and a half or something. So the clip is the baby kind of grizzling and wriggling and clearly discomforted and so on. And the mother's looking helplessly at the educator saying, what do I do, what do I do? And the parent educator is saying, you know, repeat back what the noise that the baby's making. So the baby's going, and the mother goes, and then the baby sort of pokes its tongue out, and so the educator said, poke your tongue. So the baby and the mother poke its tongue out, and then within about a minute, they're having a conversation. They're actually beginning to communicate because the mother is listening to the baby, responding to the baby. And it's what most parents do instinctively, but aren't conscious of the process that's going on. What's going on is a conversation. It's not one with words, but it's one with very, very powerful emotions and feelings and expressions being communicated. And that's the onus on us to listen to children. The holistic approach, so if you look at the right to health, it's linked with all of these rights. You can't achieve your optimum health if you don't have an adequate standard of living. I mean, we have a situation in the UK now where we have literally millions of food banks, meals being given out by food banks to impoverished families, most of whom have young children. We were just talking over dinner that we now have 1 in 3 children living in poverty. Those children cannot achieve their optimum health and development while they're living in poverty. Teachers are having to give out food to children at school because they come in too hungry to learn. You can't be healthy without having adequate protection from violence and exploitation. There needs to be rehabilitation for children who have been harmed, who've been abused, who've been exploited, proper rehabilitation to enable them to achieve their health. Name and nationality seems maybe more obscure, but I don't know if it was reported here. The case of the British citizen who went to Syria as a so-called jihadi bride, Shamima Begum. Does this name ring a bell? So she went at 16 to Syria and was married within 2 or 3 weeks of arrival. And then her first husband died, she was married again, and her second husband died. Meanwhile, she had 3 babies. The first 2 had died. She was just about to give birth to the third. And she was approached by a British journalist and told the journalist she desperately wanted to come home. So depressingly, this caused a complete outcry in the British press, where she was vilified, and the Home Secretary said that he was going to take away her citizenship, so she couldn't come back. This is a complete violation of the right to optimum health and the right to a name and nationality. It's against international law anyway to take away somebody's citizenship if it renders them stateless. He said that she could become a Bangladeshi. Her parents had come from Bangladesh. She had no links with Bangladesh. She'd been born in Britain. All her links, and Bangladeshis, why should they have her? They knew nothing of her. She'd never lived there and so on. She had no links with them, whatever. So the upshot of that was that the third baby was born, and about 3 weeks later, that baby died. So the third baby in a camp dying. So this girl, who's now 19, is stuck in a refugee camp in Syria with 3 dead babies, and her rights, whatever one thinks of what she's done, if she has committed an offence, then she should come back to Britain and she should be tried and prosecuted appropriately. But she's been punished in her absence and had the worst thing possible done to her. So we are I would argue, in complete violation of the CRC and the right to health, the right to life, and the right to name and nationality. So family life, play, education, protection from armed conflict and so on, all of these things are linked with the right to life. And again, those 4 basic principles of non-discrimination, best interests and so on need to be considered. So the implications then of a rights-based approach means that, I would argue that it means you have to think about the child think about how you respond at 3 levels. So there's firstly at the clinical level. So how are you responding to the individual child who comes into a clinic, comes into a hospital, comes into a surgery? How is their dignity treated? Are they given appropriate information? Are they treated without discrimination? Are they given a right to be heard? Are decisions made in their best interest? So thinking about how the CRC frames the way that you would interact with the child at the individual level. And then there are issues at the systems level. So the environment, the institution within which you work. So are all the services which children receive, at a policy level, at a funding level, at an organisational level, provided without discrimination and consistent with their best interests and so on. And finally, at the wider policy level, are all the necessary measures taken to create the environment in which children can achieve their best possible health. So, in other words, you have to think about the experience of the individual child, the range, the quality and the scope of health services, and the systems, the context, the environment within which the child, the wider ecology, if you like, within which the child lives. So at the individual level, as I say, the Committee on the Rights of the Child have argued consistently that children should be, all children really, I mean the wording of Article 12 is that every child capable of forming a view should have the right to express that view and have it taken seriously. But they, as I say, they would argue that needs to be understood very, very broadly to all children, that all children should be able to be involved in decisions consistent with their age and maturity, and that they should be able to take increasing levels of responsibility in accordance with capacity. So I don't know what the law is in Germany, or whether it varies, whether there are different regional, whether it's federal or whether it's a regional practice in terms of what the law says. But so in the UK, for example, we have so the child up to 16 in statute, the decisions would be made by the parents on the child's behalf, and after 16 would be made by the child. But then we have a Supreme Court ruling, the Gillick judgment, which said that where children can demonstrate capacity below that age, they should be able to take responsibility for decisions for themselves. And that would be consistent with Article 5 and this concept of evolving capacities. You can't be involved in decision making if you don't have access to appropriate information, and you also need time and space to be heard and to be listened to, and to feel that you're going to be valued, that what you're going to say is going to be taken seriously. Article 12 doesn't talk about whatever children say must happen. It's not giving them autonomy in decision making. What it's saying is that they need to be respected and taken seriously. And if a decision goes against the way that they want them to go, then the explanation should be provided and given as to the reasons that that has happened. And children need to have some degree of privacy, and they need to have a degree of safety. There's been quite a lot of research over the years about how children experience their engagement with health professionals, and a very consistent message comes out of a lot of that research is that the child feels that they're invisible in the conversation, that the conversation takes place between the parent and the doctor, or the parent and the nurse, and the child is not engaged in any of that process at all. They're simply a sort of observer rather than an active participant. And then at the systemic level, so all service must be available to all children. They have to be of the highest possible quality. Services need to be available without discrimination. And they need to be culturally sensitive and appropriate for different communities. So there are issues then about the kind of policies that operate within the health system, within the health service, about who makes decisions about where clinics are held, when they're held. Are they done to suit the convenience of consultants and administrators, or are they done to suit the best interests of the widest number of children? And who benefits most from the way that the services are run? And are there mechanisms for reaching out to all communities? I had a very salutary experience of this many years ago. I was working for a local authority in London, and it was actually the authority where Margaret Thatcher had lived, and she. They had a policy whenever they were advertising something for the local authority. They had a little statement at the bottom saying, Barnet, the London Borough of Barnet is an equal opportunities employer and welcomes applications from all members of the community. And then that Barnet was now only interested in white, local British people. It didn't want immigrants, it didn't want people of colour and so on. So the way in which those messages are communicated has a huge impact on how confident people feel about using services and approaching services. And does the service acknowledge different cultural practices and the importance of addressing those practices in the way that services are provided? And our services is data disaggregated, so you actually know who is and isn't achieving access to the services or benefiting from those services. There was an interesting piece of work done again in Chile some years ago where they were looking at their maternal mortality rates, and they found that, you know, they were systematically going up, and they were quite pleased that they were going up. And then they disaggregated the data. And what they found was they'd gone up for the majority population, but for the indigenous communities, they were the mortality rates were catastrophically high and hadn't shifted at all. And so they then needed to investigate into why that was. And what they found was that the way that the clinics were operating, the kind of services that they were providing, were not taking any account whatsoever of traditional birth practices within the indigenous communities, or the values that they held, or the status of women, or the vulnerability of women, and none of those things, or the distances they had to travel to get to the clinics, none of those things were being addressed. So once they started to disaggregate the data, break it down in a sort of rights-based approach, they then began to be able to target through a listening approach to what was needed to actually turn those death rates around, and they significantly then were able to reduce the maternal mortality rate. I mean, another example in South Africa, where a lot of children live for a very long time in hospital with HIV or tuberculosis, and they're often a long way away from their parents. And so an NGO was invited in to work with some of these children, months, often until they die. The children are in hospital. So they brought in an NGO to work with the children, and what this NGO did, they came in with a whole pile of socks and a whole pile of buttons and ribbons and so on. So each child went into this big bag and pulled out a sock. So he put the sock on their hand. And then they sewed on buttons for eyes and a mouth. And then they named their puppet. So this was John. And then they got them to sit around in a circle and introduce their puppet, and then got the children to talk about what their puppet was thinking and what their puppet was feeling and what happened to their puppet at night times. And an extraordinary amount of information came out that the children wouldn't have felt able to talk about if they were talking about themselves, but felt very confident in talking about it, because some of them would say things like, there's a wonderful video of this, some of them would say, well, I have to protect John at night because he gets very sudden lonely and sometimes he cries. And what they called the nurses aunties. And they said sometimes the aunties hit us, sometimes the aunties aren't there at night and we're frightened, sometimes the bigger patients bully the little ones. So all this stuff came out, and they were then able, by listening to the children and creating an environment, begin to change some of the policies. That one of the things the children talked about, probably more than anything else, was they didn't know if and when their parents were ever going to come and visit them. So they began to look at how they could really improve the communications between the parents and the children. So creating policies based on listening to people's actual experiences is important. And then you've got the right to health at the societal level. So, as you know, health services are not the primary means of realising the right to health, and huge aspects of government policy or lack of policy or the wrong policies can impact on the health and well-being of children. So if you're going to make a commitment as a country, if Germany is committed to the realisation of children's rights, the full implementation of the CRC in relation to health, then it has to look at the social economic determinants of health and what sits around the child coming into the hospital that impacts on their health and well-being. And so, I mean, I would argue that the convention demands, if you like, of health professionals that you become advocates for children, that you, probably more than many other professionals, bear witness to the impact of government policy on children's lives. You know, the impact negatively, the impact positively, what works, what doesn't work, what's failing, what's missing. And in a sense, I would argue you therefore have a duty to speak up and campaign and advocate to address those weaknesses in government policy. Interestingly, I know a lot of paediatricians don't see rights as their responsibility. They don't see rights as a relevant part of their work. I was at a meeting a couple of 3 or 4 years ago in Uganda, and it was a meeting to try and put together a training package for health professionals working with children on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And there was a man sitting there, it was about 30 people sitting around, and this one man was clearly bored, and eventually he got up and said, "I'm leaving, you know, this is absolutely nothing to do with me. I treat children, I'm not a child rights person. It's really, really not relevant for me." And this woman sort of stared at him. She was a very gently spoken Muslim woman, wearing a hijab, and came across as very gentle. And she kind of pinioned him, and she said, "Don't leave. Don't you dare leave." She said, How can you say that children's rights are not relevant for you?" And she cited a case. There had been a case just a few weeks before of a little girl who'd been beaten really badly by her father, and she'd been brought into hospital, and she'd been treated, patched up, repaired, as it were, and sent back home again. And she then died. So, so what she said to him is, you know, if you had been aware that she had a right to protection from violence, that she had a right to life, that you were a duty bearer, you had a responsibility, not just to treat her, but to protect her and to ensure that she didn't go right back into a situation where she was going to be beaten and harmed again. You have an absolute obligation. And so he sort of sat down rather shamefacedly and sat through to the end of the meeting. Whether it changed his mind or not, I don't know. But she was very effective. So there are many, many, many social determinants. I mean, you know all these things. You know, issues in the environment, huge issues around violence and the violence that children experience, growing problems of bullying online, cyberbullying, grooming and so on, sexual exploitation online, FGM, early marriage, other harmful practices. We've had some challenges in the UK with doctors and others citing cultural relativism as a reason for not intervening to protect children. So, for example, if there are children from, say, Nigeria, where there is a much more widespread practice of corporal punishment, quite severe corporal punishment, saying, well, this is part of their culture and therefore we shouldn't interfere because this is inappropriate. And similarly with FGM. But the point about the convention rights are that they are universal and they apply to all children. Now, the way that you intervene needs to take account of cultural traditions and values and needs to be respectful of that, but ultimately the child is entitled to protection from those forms of violence. Poverty is clearly a huge issue, and then there are wider social factors. Discrimination and racism, migration is a huge issue, unregulated advertising, and social media pressures and so on, which are growing concerns. So we have you know, I won't run through these, but you know, there is so much evidence of the way in which socio-economic factors impact on outcomes of children. If you look just at the early marriage, you know, girls who are married early suffer from an enormous range of risks, dying in childbirth, and risk to babies and so on and so forth. So there are huge problems associated with inequality, injustice, and wider social factors. So what does this mean then in practice? It means adopting a kind of principled approach to the way that you think about your work, which is inclusive, non-discriminatory, respectful, which takes account of best interests both of the individual child but also children as a constituency, and in which you are accountable and there are mechanisms of feedback and accountability for what you do. Some hospitals have systems where they after children are discharged from hospital, there's some mechanism for bringing children back and getting some input into their experience of hospital, their experience of treatment, and then that can be used in order to improve the quality of care for other children. It needs to be a listening approach, which involves listening to, informing children, giving children the information they need, and listening to them, respecting their evolving capacities, but also engaging in wider consultations. There was some years ago now, but there was going to be built in Nottingham in England. They were going to build a new children's hospital, and the commission was going out to architects to bid for this, to build this hospital, and one of the conditions was that they had to, as a condition of getting the contract, was they had to consult with children in the design of the hospital. This was quite soon after the convention came into being, so people were all enthusiastic about it. So they did. I mean, there were lots and lots of things came up, but one of the things that the children came up with was that when they came into the hospital, you know, in the reception area, the little children really hated the fact that they couldn't see over the desk to see who was behind the desk, so they wanted a desk which had a grown-up height and then a lower height so that they could see what was going on behind the desk. There was another nice piece of work that we did when I was working in the UK, when I was running the NGO. We had a competition to try and get people to start thinking about listening to children and what it meant. So there was this wonderful, it was the winning from the community health nurses in a very, very poor part of East London. And they had worked with preschool children, 3 and 4 year olds, to reflect on their community and what it was like to live in their community. So they got them to do these 2 murals. One was as it was, and one was as they would like it to be. So the one as it was, you know, full of great, you know, motorways with lorries and pollution coming out of them, and high-rise blocks of flats with rats and cockroaches in, and nowhere to play, and it was just all grey and concrete and so on. And then they had that as they would like it. So there were houses, not high-rise blocks. The lorries had gone, the rats and the cockroaches had gone, and there were lots of flowers, there were swings and so on and so forth, trees. But everywhere was still concrete, so they didn't put any grass in this. So they then had an open evening, and they invited all the local councillors and community leaders and so on to come and meet with the children, and, you know, the children were able to talk through their vision for the future. So all these councillors said to the children, but, you know, why is it all concrete? You know, why haven't you got grass down here? So the children said, these 3 and 4 year olds said, because if you have grass, you can't see the needles from the drug users, you can't see the broken glass, and you can't see the dog shit. So they knew far more about what they needed to keep themselves safe on the ground than the community leaders and the politicians. So some of the ways in which these models have been, oh sorry, I haven't finished. So yes, and then an informed approach looking at analysing the barriers to health. I mean, I think it's really important in most communities that that there is some sort of analysis done of what it is that different groups of children are facing in relation to realising the best possible health. So whether it's children with disabilities or children from migrant communities or children from the poorest communities or children from particular housing estates, or what are the barriers that they're facing and how can you work with them to overcome those barriers within their communities. Involving children and their families in monitoring and evaluation so that there is some input from the community into how services are experienced by the recipients. And then a holistic approach which looks at community-based strategies, advocacy for resources and change, and campaigning really for a greater commitment to children's rights. So there are some really interesting models. So in Ottawa, I was a friend and colleague of mine has developed. She's a paediatrician. She was director of the child protection in a program in the Children's Hospital in Ottawa, and she has now set up this community-based service in a very poor, very diverse area, which is poorly served by almost everything, health, education, and so on, youth services. And she's created a hub. And so when somebody is referred, instead of going to a clinic in a hospital, they come to the hub. And the hub is a big sort of, it's a community centre, but the starting point is a room which has got a big kitchen table, and it's a kitchen with a big kitchen table and a play area and loads of toys, and everybody can come to it. So you can come with your family, the social worker can be there, the doctor will be there, maybe the community worker might be there, a youth worker, teacher can come, so that there is a comprehensive way of engaging and giving people time in a place where they feel safe within their own communities, where there is a holistic, culturally safe environment being created for people to share and talk about what they need in order to move on in their lives and get the health and other forms of care that they need. So very multi-sectoral. So, for example, she runs an early a young mothers group where they can come with their babies, and she can deal not just with their healthcare needs but their needs in relation to immigration status, in relation to accessing benefits, in relation to accessing housing and so on, all of which have as much bearing on their and their children's health as the immediate possibilities for health services. So an example of a rights-based approach to protection from violence. So the whole range of rights obviously relevant there, and at the individual level you need to think about, what are the services, what are the measures needed to protect the individual child at risk, ensuring that she's listened to, he's listened to, that their culture is acknowledged, that they're entitled to privacy as is appropriate, which takes account of their evolving capacity, provides support to families, and balances the tensions between rights, because in some situations there are going to be differences between the child's right to protection from violence and the child's right to family life. They may not be possible to reconcile, and obviously social workers would be involved in that as well. At the community level, looking at parent education, youth services, child protection services, safer environments and so on. In the UK, for example, as we've been hit with austerity over the last 8 years, since 2008, in the borough, I live in London, in the borough that I live in, they have cut back youth services by over 80%. So there are virtually no services for young people anymore. And at the same time, we now have a spiralling problem of knife crime. So we also have a problem of more and more children being excluded from school because schools are in competition with each other for getting results. So they get rid of the children who are going to be disruptive or in care, or who are not very able, or who are going to cause problems. So you have a sort of a perfect storm, really, of factors, and those kids end up in casualty with knife wounds, many of them dying, and treating it either as a health problem or as a law enforcement problem is simply not sufficient. There has to be a more holistic approach, a collaborative approach between different professionals. So looking at the policy level at how to address those issues of poor housing, unemployment, low incomes, educational policy, and pressing for a legislative policy environment which is backed up by the necessary resources to protect children appropriately. So the impact, what we've seen over 30 years of the Convention, there have been legal reforms in many countries around the world. Child protection, child labour, marriage are much better legislated for than they used to be. There is family law and access to justice legislation which didn't exist before. More and more children are now in school, and more girls are now staying on into secondary school, and there are laws around child participation in many countries. I was in the United Arab Emirates earlier this year, where they have introduced a child protection law for the first time ever, and again it was initiated. They had been being pressed by the Committee on the Rights of the Child to legislate for child protection, but up until that point there was literally nothing the state could do to interfere with family life. The family were absolutely supreme. So a case came up, a little girl called Wahima was tortured and then beaten to death by her father, and the state were not able to do anything in that situation. So they decided that they did need to introduce a child protection law, and it has taken them a number of years to get agreement of it, and they were holding a conference to launch their child protection division in the government on this child protection legislation. And most people were really welcoming it, but there were several people at the conference who were very, very angry about it, because the conference coincided with the highly reported case of a Saudi girl who had escaped from her family. I think she'd gone to Thailand, and the Canadian government had given her asylum. They'd taken her as an asylum seeker, and there were many people at the conference who were furious about this and said that this is what will happen with this law. It will break down parental controls, it will undermine the family, it will undermine Islam, and will take us into a direction we don't want to go. And indeed, I was introduced as I spoke. Because I was speaking at the conference, and I was introduced having got this honorary doctorate at Carleton University in Canada, and somebody got up and walked out and said, "I'm not prepared to be spoken to by a Canadian." They thought I was Canadian, by a Canadian, because they've done this terrible thing and taken a child. So there are very different cultural values, but basically the CRC does require that there is capacity, and many countries now have recognised the need to be able to intervene in family life where it's necessary. There are more examples of visibility of children, children's ministries, transparent and disaggregated budgets, and child rights impact assessments, where a piece of legislation or policy is being drafted and they have to do a child rights impact assessment. Does this affect children positively, negatively? How can it be made more positive for children? And then there are lots of rights-based tools. Rights Respecting Schools, which has been very widely developed in the UK by UNICEF. I think there are about 1,600 schools now which are rights respecting, which have been independently evaluated and found to be enormously effective both for children and for teachers. Baby-friendly hospitals, child-friendly cities, and so on. Culture and values are much, much slower to move, but in some countries do constitute the basis for framing laws and policies. I think there has been a growing recognition of the importance of listening to children and the visibility of the child within the family. And globally, certainly survival outcomes have improved. So these are some of the models that we've seen. So in summary then, I would say that children's rights does offer, a potential transformatory lens through which to look at health and to bring to bear on health. It's not a blueprint and it's not a magic wand and it doesn't solve all problems, but it offers a principled framework for advocacy and for service development and for a commitment really to children So it's different, and it involves really analysing barriers, looking at what are the things that are preventing us moving forward, and what are children saying about that. And I think that it expands the role of health practitioners into becoming also advocates for children. So thank you very much.